Ah, hello, Krishna.
Hello everyone, I'm Bradley.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good and it's been a while, so
Yeah,
apologies for not being so active on ORES or Devovom.
that's fine.
I've
Yeah,
been, yeah, working in a full-time job. It keeps me a lot busy, so. But yeah, I miss you guys.
yeah. I've been wondering how you've been doing, and glad to hear that everything's going well for you.
Yeah, I too missed you and Jesse a lot, so I thought I
Yeah,
should drop by today and present something.
yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, well, welcome back. Yeah, so
Yeah, thanks.
Krishna and Ankit here. So, and Jesse's here. Hello, Jesse. All right. So why don't we get started? So welcome to the meeting. And we've, you know, started getting it into the new year, and so we've got some papers and projects that are ongoing. We're also kind of coming up with new ideas for things. We have deadlines. Um, I think today, first of all, I'd like to say if anyone has any updates they want to give before I start in with the things I was going to talk about. Okay, so Jesse won't be able to engage or speak much, but he should be able to listen in, so that's good. Um, okay. Well, if there are no
Uh,
updates. Oh, go ahead.
actually say something general right now.
Okay.
I mentioned this in the lab admin, but we did get submitted to you opening some of our working with them to see their program for like basically getting us some new opening students that may operate as a kind of intern for a bit. That I'm not quite sure what the next step is. I think I'll probably hear back from Casey. I think I'll email her because it was a little bit unclear. There was a form, and Casey knows I'm going to do it, but I'm not quite sure what the next step for. I'm not sure if there's going to be like a hey, Casey's going to get back to me and say, okay, well the next step is this, or if it's just sort of okay, it's listed now in their materials or not. But we do. I submitted a pretty general. I submitted a kind of a general internship description. I think that's what she advised me to do rather than listing a bunch of specific projects.
Right.
And from the general description, they can look at some of the things. I'm going to have to go through some of the uh, descriptions that we have on our website about that. But that's it. Yeah. Other than that, I'm in Boston and it's very snowy here.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's what I've heard. Um, yeah. So thank you for doing that. Yeah, I think all we really need is a general description. I think if people once people contact us, we can give them more details. So yeah, we need to go through those descriptions and kind of work. Well, I mean they're in probably decent shape for now, but they need to be revised a little bit more. Always need to revise them as things move forward. So I would, but I would definitely just kind of like for now, there would be a general interest in whatever people want to do, and then when they onboard, we say these are the projects. Would you like to pick one, or would you like to sort of, I mean, I guess for an internship, it would be nice to have them pick one at the beginning, but that's something they can do once they reach us, reach out to us.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me share my screen. So I guess the first thing I'd like to talk about is we've been trying to do. We haven't done the Slack review in a while. We've done like different project updates, and I want to do a project update on virtual reality this week, or the virtual reality initiatives. but I also want to go through some things on the Slack, just make sure that we're catching up on some of those things as well. So the first one, we have Brain Organoids, and again, Brain Organoids is always very active. So this is a channel where we're talking about models for looking at like brain growth and development, morphogenesis. Sometimes we get other organs that we talk about organoids, which are these little organs that they grow outside the body. They grow them in a chamber. They grow them from stem cells, and they can replicate different organs. So they have brain organoids, they have stomach organoids, liver organoids. And then we also talk about stem cells and regenerative medicine sometimes in here too. So if you go through this channel, there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. A lot of good papers get posted in here. And I know Arthur is working on a document, and I don't think too many people were in that meeting, but I think this was either last week or the week before, where we discussed a path forward on this document. So this is the organoids document that Arthur has generated. And so this is, right now, it's sort of a catalog of these different things that are in the channel. So, he's got it organized in terms of brain modeling, components of the brain, topics without a link, some topics in general neuroscience, brain organoids themselves, which is sort of supposed to be the focus of the channel, but we go pretty far afield. And so there's a lot of stuff in here. Evolution, general biology, so that gives people a little bit of a background. And actually, these are all links from different things that have been in the channel. So, and we've talked about a strategy for organizing this. And Jesse will like this. I suggested an annotated bibliography of some type, where we take some of these references and we kind of describe them. Some of these are papers, some of these are articles, whatever. But I think it's something. If we do this right, it'll be a really nice reference for people coming into the brain organoids area, but also coming into the lab wanting to engage in some of this work, at least at a very high level. Now, I know that Morgan is actually trying to find out how to create a wet lab for doing organoids work, and so that's something he's been working on. I haven't heard an update on that in a while, but suffice it to say that may be on the radar soon. So Arthur's working on this document, and Morgan's working on seeing how we might maybe have a wet lab setting to do some interesting brain organoids research. And then there's there are other possibilities, like we've talked in the past about simulating brain organoids, using brain organoids, the biological thing, as a model for like a computational model where you can actually look at cell differentiation in a more controlled setting than, say, like an embryo. So in our DevaWorm group, we talk a lot about simulating embryos, but in this case, it would be simulating this process of cell differentiation and growth, but in a more controlled environment. So, there are a lot of papers in this channel. We have some reviews on brain organoids to get people up to speed on it. We have maybe some questions. I think Arthur asked a question about how do you generate brain organoids? Do you generate them from pluripotent cells only, or other types of cells? And so, I answered that question. And again, if you have a question on any of this stuff, if you're curious, you can ask it in the channel. So yeah, there are a lot of papers on. So we have like this paper on induced pluripotent cells and wild-type colony patterning. We have this design of this platform where you can take pluripotent stem cells and turn them into these patterned cultures, which again is something that people study in embryos, but they do it sort of in an embryo. They don't do it in this sort of cell culture environment. There's a deep learning platform for organoid image analysis. There are other types of techniques like cellular barcoding, which is a nice method that they use to look at the identity of cells and their genomic identity. So that's a technique that they use in a lot of different contexts, but this is something that you can use specifically for organoids. The evolution of synthetic receptor systems, this is something that's a little bit outside of organoids, but still interesting. This is actually a nice review on some of these synthetic receptor systems. So this is a review on, over the past 2 decades, synthetic biologists have repurposed physical parts and concepts of natural receptors to engineer synthetic ones. And so this technology implements customized sense and respond programs that link a cell's interaction with the extracellular and intracellular cues to user-defined responses. So basically, they're creating these communication systems on the cell membrane. They're doing this artificially. This happens in nature. They're just mimicking this mechanism. And the more we understand about these signaling mechanisms, the more we can manipulate cells to do what we want them to do. And so this is a sort of a review of what people have been doing in mammalian cells. I think it's really interesting. It's not something I think about too much, but it's nice to see these things come up. And so this is a receptor system at the cell membrane where you have a receptor, and there's a sort of a confirmation that the input molecule has to make to dock in this receptor, and then it triggers things on the other side of the membrane. So it drives a signaling output within the cell. And so if you have a lot of, say, some sort of amino acid or protein outside the cell floating around, it can bind with the cell receptor on the surface and trigger things within the cell. A lot of times that's changing gene expression or doing something in the cell to degrade protein production, where there are a number of things that can happen. So, this is a nice review of this, the very complex, hard thing to understand, because there's so many different possibilities here. But it goes through a lot of this literature and the different models. Now, there are opportunities perhaps to create computational models of this as well. This is not something we typically think about when we create computational models of biology. We think about the genome, we think about the cells. We don't really think about the signaling too much. So that's another opportunity. So that's I think that's about it in this channel. So nice to see people active in that channel. Last week we talked about Breitenberg Vehicles. There hasn't been too much going on in this channel, but I really do want to revisit some of the Breitenberg Vehicles platforms that we have. So we have a couple of platforms. I think I mentioned this in a previous meeting. We have BraGenBrain, which is the genetic algorithm approach. We have another platform which involves Hebbian learning in a single agent. And then we have a platform where we have collectives of vehicles responding to common stimuli and looking at sort of the collective behavior that results. I was actually going through that last one, and I was thinking about more about that. And it's, we think about collective intelligence, and we think about things that are, like we think about swarm intelligence, how swarms behave when they're, traveling together. They're interacting with their neighbors, and they form these sort of shapes. So if you ever look at like a bird flock or a swarm of ants or bees or wasps, they always have these shapes. They look like blobs. But sometimes when they change direction, they have these really intricate patterns. And so I thought that was interesting, and I was looking in the literature for some work. If anyone's done any work on classifying these shapes or understanding the shapes, not so much the swarm, how the swarm builds from a single individual. People have kind of worked on that. There's been this classic work in computer science on Boids, where the Boids are, you have individual agents that have, nature-inspired optimization algorithms, exactly. Where, you have single agents, they communicate with their neighbors, and then if you do this in parallel, you end up with these nice collective structures that result from collective behavior. Like, particle swarm optimization, firefly synchronization. Yeah, this is exactly the area I'm talking about. But the specific area I was interested in was, like, how do you take those shapes and how do you understand them as sort of like whole structures? Like analyzing the shapes or kind of like figuring out things. Maybe they're predictable, maybe they're just generated by, chance encounters. So I couldn't find any literature on that. I was really surprised. And maybe it is. Maybe I'm not asking the right question. I don't know. There's a whole literature though on this sort of thing from a computational point of view. Like if you have single agents and you have a population of agents, how do they optimize things like path? Like they could use like the traveling salesman problem. They could try to solve that. So ants actually do kind of solve that when they look for food. They go out from a central nest, they go and they forage and they lay down pheromone to mark their trail. And so they explore all these trails and they come back to the nest and they kind of figure out, the trails to food or the trails around the environment. And they can do computations on those trails because you have pheromone as a marker. And they can, find their way around that network. Yeah, I read about Ankit. I read about the ant colony optimization. Yes, it was used for the TSP. So yeah, they use it for different optimization problems. They'll use it for like robot teams where you have to get robots out of they have to maybe rescue people from a cave, or they have to navigate some territory that, is dangerous for humans to do. So they have to map it out. They have to be able to communicate in a team and optimize their movements to best do their work. And so all those things are at the level of the individual. What I'm talking about is like, how do they behave collectively? In the platform that we have for our Breitenberg vehicles, the agents don't actually communicate directly, but they do form these kind of swarms. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. What they have is a collective stimulus, and then they gravitate towards that stimulus or away from that stimulus. But they do it in mass. So, you have a bunch of agents. If you have enough agents in your population, they either, try to avoid a stimulus or they are attracted to the stimulus. And in doing so, without even communicating with one another, they form these, almost like these rivulets or flows throughout the environment. And so, I guess describing that collective behavior maybe is like a flow, or, we know we have really good mathematical models of flows, but to describe that whole process as a flow and to see if there may be some predictive value to it, or whether it's just kind of a random thing or what, that's the thing I was looking for. And I could not find any literature on it. So I'm just putting that out there if people are, and I think it might, run across something. If that's something that people want to bring to my attention, that would be appreciated. I didn't know exactly what the right term to use for that, but yeah, I never thought of this. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know, and it's quite possible no one studied it. So it would be like an opportunity to say, we have these Breitenberg vehicles, which are these, basically these agents that have these basic capabilities for these taxis behaviors. So they either move towards light or they move away from light, or they move towards a resource or away from a resource. And if you have them do this at a certain density, population density, they can form these collective structures, or these, I don't even know if they're collective structures, but they're definitely mass structures. And they sort of flow like traffic. It's almost, I don't want to say this, but it's almost kind of like having a cars going down a highway, and then they're all sort of blindfolded to the presence of other cars. And they just kind of like avoid obstacles, and you'll see a flow. Actually, you do see that in traffic sometimes. If there's like a barrier, if there's like some debris in the road, and you're traveling down a crowded highway, and people are swerving to avoid it, and you'll see like these patterns, these flow patterns in the traffic that are kind of sometimes they can be dangerous, but sometimes they do form these sort of flow patterns. So it's very, very interesting. So, all right, so that's Breitenberg Vehicles. I want to revisit
Do you
that.
want to like talk a bit more about like flows?
Yeah, yeah,
So like what you talked about is like really interesting. Like most of these algorithms, like they are based on your movement towards that optimum, but like no one has actually studied like how collectively like it's happening. So like because most of these algorithms, I think their goal is not to do collectively, but uh, it might be a result of like how they're moving. Like that's something I think I understand. But yeah, I don't think there's been a lot related to their shapes. That's something we could look into if we have
yeah,
time actually.
yeah.
Yeah, and could you talk a bit about flows?
Do you want me to talk about
Because
flows or?
yeah. Because recently I was some time ago I was like reading about gradient descent. Like yeah, so I was reading somewhere that someone was saying in his blog that like gradient descent could also be applied to like flows. Like this, he was saying that the person was saying in his blog that the the descent what you're doing can like easily be like approximated to like a gradient flow. So that could like possibly open up like a lot of uh, things in optimization. So this is like what I know about flow.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, so I mean, like flows are interesting because they're very complex systems, or they can be. So you have laminar flows, which are like where you have just particles moving at a certain rate, and it's uniform, and that's not that hard. That's it's just like water flowing through a pipe. We have no, it's unobstructed. It just goes through a pipe. It's rate limiting, but it's like you're going at all the uh, particles are going at a certain speed, and there's no problem. Now it gets more interesting when you start getting turbulence, which is where you have obstacles. Maybe inside the pipe it's getting a little, there's some deposition of different hard hard water particles that are kind of hanging on the edge of the pipe, and so the water now is having to go around these obstacles. But in doing so, they sort of locally rate limit themselves. So they you have like a flow. Which I can use my board for this, I suppose. I'll need to get this out. Just a moment. And I don't think this will work unless I do this. So it'll be easier to do it this way. So let me share my screen. All right. So you have a laminar flow, and this is not going to work like this. Okay. So it's like through a pipe that's sort of a regular size. There's water flowing through it. It's a uniform rate. So it's not that hard. When you get like things like turbulence is when you get a pipe that has like some obstacles within the pipe, And so now the water is flowing, but it's having to divert around these obstacles. So now you have the same amount of water as in the laminar case, but now it's having to squeeze its way through these obstacles. And that's when you start to get turbulence. So eventually you can get turbulence where the water is, kind of swirling around. And, this is true in like rivers, where like in a river, you'll have water flows that are unobstructed, but sometimes in rivers you have like obstacles. Sometimes the water is moving really fast. And so every time it hits like a rock or a branch in the water, it's, you get these pools and eddies and things like that, swirling flows. So the flows kind of back up upon themselves and go forward, and they try to squeeze through these obstacles. So that's when you start to get this turbulent flow. Now, turbulent flow is the case where it's important to be able to optimize. And this is where optimization comes in, because these are very highly nonlinear things. So you want to be able to predict the flow, or you want to be able to understand it better. You have to have some sort of optimization process, because it's hard to do this on the basis of just looking at the flow itself. And so there are a couple of mathematical tools for that. There are the Navier-Stokes equations, which actually are differential equations, which do a pretty good job of predicting and simulating flows. So a lot of the computer graphics, when they model flows of water in computer graphics, they've done some really good work on using Navier-Stokes to predict what those should look like. So you can like have a waterfall that comes down, and back of your, if I had like a little background for my camera here, I could have like some waterfall where the water falls at a uniform rate. It would more or less be uniform. It would be a laminar flow, and it wouldn't be that hard to simulate. But if I wanted to simulate a turbulent flow, then that's a little harder. And so you could do this using differential equations. Then there are models like Lagrangian models, which actually can be used to not only simulate turbulent flows, but to track those flows over time, sort of like as a dynamical system, and actually predict structures or shapes within that flow. So this is actually what I was talking about earlier, that you can, using Lagrangian methods, you can actually find like little structures in the flow, like ridges or other types of things. You can actually look at the diffusion of things in flows. So if you have a very complex flow, and I think we've talked about this with respect to like plume following, when insects do plume following. Plumes are notoriously turbulent. It's usually like some odor that emanates from a source, and it goes through the environment. And oftentimes you have, in any environment, there's small fluctuations in wind direction, things that are moving through the environment, creating a wake in the air. And so there's a lot of stuff going on with respect to plumes, because plumes are very light and they float around. So if you watch a candle burn, you'll see like a plume of smoke coming from the candle, and it often is very wavy. And that's sort of turbulence. And so insects have to follow those plumes. And oftentimes, that their movements look very, they look very jerky. They kind of do this when they come towards and that's because they're following the plume. They're following that information. And so I don't know what the state of the art is in terms of predicting plumes or plume following in insects. I know there were some talks. There was a talk at Maine about plume following in insects as like a neural behavior, and then there's been some other work on that as well. So Ankit says, so it's mostly differential equations, right? The flow you're talking about, although yes, I posted something related to flows and optimization. I mean, yeah, you can use optimization. I mean, in as much as any time you can model a system with differential equations and do the simulations, you can also use optimization techniques to solve those problems as well. Because you're just, with the differential equations, a lot of times you're just describing it. So this is Francis Bach gradient flows. Let's take a look at this. Oh, it's not going to let me do that. Okay. There we go. So this is, let me share my screen. This is something Ankit put in the chat here. And this is effortless optimization through gradient flows. So this is optimization algorithms often rely on simple intuitive principles, but their analysis quickly leads to a lot of algebra, where the original idea is not transparent. So this is gradient is local information. So yeah, you're trying to find a quest for local descent. So in differential equations is often, trying to find a local solution to the problem. It's very similar. So you use, you could use one approach or the other. I think gradient descent is nice because you can, sort of find these optima. You can use things like agents, and it's not, you can actually do this automatically. So the agents are just finding this optimum. You run the simulation. I mean, it's a similar thing with differential equations, I suppose, but and so we're kind of trying to find these lower or these local information minima. So here we are with this. So you're trying to find the steepest descent along this negative gradient, and then from gradient descent to gradient flows. So now actually, I guess they're talking about using flows as a way to stimulate this descent or something like that. Okay, I see what you mean. So this is like where you have this sort of, so this is a descent versus a flow. So this is a gradient descent with a piecewise affine interpolation between the iterates versus gradient flow on the same time scale for a logistic regression problem. So this is the same problem, and you're getting this flow versus the descent, and it's smoother with the flow. Okay. This is interesting.
I mean, it feels as though like this gradient flow is a bit greedy if you look at it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So I mean, this is the simulation here they're showing. So it's kind of going down smoothly, but it is. Yeah, it comes with pros and cons. Yeah, so this is a comparison of flow and diffusion. The flow is deterministic and converges to a stationary point of F. Here the global minimum, while the diffusion is stochastic and converges to a distribution, which is typically not a point mass. So this is the diffusion is in blue, and it's sort of stochastic, so you see all this sort of fluctuation in the path, and it's kind of overshooting the point, but it's kind of getting to the same place. Yeah. And then they get into properties of gradient flows, which have this, they can work through the math here. I'm not going to work through that. Yeah. So this looks interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is another interesting thing here. So actually, I think we're talking about two things. One is that you can solve flows, using certain techniques. Another is this gradient flow, which is an alternate to gradient descent, or at least they're using it in a similar way to gradient descent. And the mathematics are different, but you're sort of exploiting that property of the flow and what it can do for you. So, yeah. So look at that blog post. I think that'll be good if you're interested in that. Does anyone have anything to say about that? And you don't have to comment on the math or anything, just okay. Well, thank you for bringing that up, Ankit. That was nice. And it's a lot to think about, because I wanted to bring that up because I've been thinking about it all week. So it'd be something I think Krishna wants to say
Yeah,
something.
it's honestly it's a
Yeah.
little bit complicated for me as well because like yeah, it goes into the mathematics like Lipschitz and all that. I don't really understand what that is at this point. It's like
Yeah,
it's pretty much deep maths and optimization.
right.
So like I'll have to literally like need to know the basics before like I actually can understand most of it. So yeah, it will take a little bit time for me to get also.
Yeah.
Hi everyone.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, great. What about you?
Oh, pretty good.
I really like your lamp, the butterfly one.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Is it an angel or butterfly?
I don't know exactly. It's like a butterfly. Yeah, I don't know.
Ah, okay, great. I like that. So I'll be sharing my screen.
Okay.
I'll be presenting on a thing related to machine learning.
Okay.
So is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So I'll be presenting on Towhee's open source machine learning pipelines. So what is a pipeline? A machine learning pipeline is a way to codify and automate the workflow it takes to produce a machine learning model. So instead of having scattered blocks of, you can say, functionalities, we make them into a process, and which makes our work automated. So we don't have to like connect the parts; they're like in a way already connected. So it consists of multiple sequencing steps, like from data extraction to data processing, as well as to display the final results. So this is an example of Tohi's open source pipeline. So you have okay. So what are operators here? These end op, add op. These are the operators. So these are the blocks of functionality. You have a starting operator, which which acts like an input. It states that the pipeline is starting here, and the end operation like it closes the pipeline somehow. And the middle operators are the operator where the real work begins. So the input of one operator here is the output of other operators. So for example, I'll get back to them later. So what is Tohi? It's a flexible open source, you can say, framework, open source organization under Zilliz as well. So it's oriented, application oriented, and it aims to make democratize anything to vec, which allows anything to anything to be converted into a vector, which can like further be used into some other programs like vector database of Milvus or other. So one more thing that it has is that with just few lines of code, very complex machine learning pipelines can be made. And internally it wraps around PyTorch and Scikit-learn OpenCV for visual data things. So problems that can be solved, I'll give a brief pros of it. So one is this, like it makes the process really easy. You don't have to code like 500 lines for a thing. Just like with a couple of lines, maybe less than 20, you can do a thing which earlier used to require so much code. And that's better for organization like TVOM itself, because most of the work is biologically oriented, and a biologist may not want to spend a lot of time coding on the things, and he or she can just get the things in relatively smaller effort. As well as one more thing about machine learning is, as there are no like standard models, so there are a lot of different models which can create a great level of confusion. So if you want to find the state of the art technology, you might have to dig into a lot of things and decide that which one is state of the art here. So too many models implemented exist without any interface standard. So that's an issue. So, and the other thing is ML operations. So making a thing is a different thing, and then deploying it to production is a different thing, and that's the problem that's very common in machine learning. Because it's relative new relative new nature. So the DevOps is not like very pretty much defined. You don't have rules of thumb here. And if you want to change the model, then you'd have to redeploy the model, which can be a tedious task as well as time and resource consuming. So yeah, if you make the things in pipeline, then it's something that is quite easy to attain. So I'll be presenting an example of duplicate image detection. So you just have to import the library. You have to import NumPy. NumPy, as you people be knowing, it's the standard Python library to work with arrays and all. So and you have to just define the embedding pipelines. So what is actually happening is here everything is converted into its embeddings, and that is the main function of the pipeline, just create embeddings, and then we can just simply compare the embeddings and define a threshold, like how similar they should be. So it's just like how many 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 line of code, and you can pretty much check with every images like you're locally putting there, and you can easily get like which one of them symbol, and it doesn't matter that if they are cropped or in different colors, maybe one is grayscale, one is color, the embeddings would be like sufficient to predict the closeness. And so contribution guidelines, since it's open source, it needs contributor, and contributing to us, everyone here, like we are already like kind of an open source organization, so I may not need to explain everything here because so I'll just say like it's just like get into Slack and find good first issues. They're labeled in the GitHub, so find a good first issue and then just contribute. So references, and that's it. So it's pretty much fun when I came across this thing, this Tohi framework for making embeddings and pipelines. That's something that is very like helpful if you take this from a machine learning perspective, as well as if you are using machine learning for other tasks, like it's aiding your research and studies. Then also like it's even a better thing, because you don't need to dig into the code. You don't need to have like very good computer skills for that as well. So yeah, that's it. So, thank you.
Well, that's great.
Krishna? Thank you.
Thank you. Could you do you mind putting a link to your slides in the chat, or?
Sure, I
Okay.
will do that.
Yeah. Okay, Ankit?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, so like I wanted to ask, like, are you working on this or what?
Yeah, I'm contributing on it. Just like started, not contributing for a long time, but yeah, now I'm contributing to it, contributing to the main art.
Like, so like, do they have anything for like multi, like parallel training, distributed training, anything?
Yeah, it actually they are more set to use the brain model as well, but currently work is being done on multiple and distributing training as well. So that is something they do are like working on the operators, as I tell that a pipeline use operators that are the block of functionalities. So work on distributing computing and distributed training would be done in future as well. So, but currently now it's just on making the pipeline itself and the multiverse vector database for storing them, because it can be traditionally saved into your things are not they won't give a good result if you're storing the things on an SQL or NoSQL thing. You need a vectorized database as well. So multiverse is the thing, and yeah, a lot of development is going on. So
Yeah. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you. And so yeah, working on a machine learning thing. It was like mainly Bradley who hooked me on to machine learning. So my first mentor who introduced machine learning to me, who introduced open source to me. So thanks for his encouragement. So yeah,
No problem.
you do well. You have good mentors. So all credit to him.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So,
Actually, I was just scrolling through some of my like saved things. So
yeah,
like about TSP, I had an interesting paper that I just found. I think Krishna would also find it interesting.
okay,
So do you mind if I like share it? Like I haven't read it, but like I think Bradley, you could maybe understand a lot more
okay,
about. So like let me just put the link in the chat.
okay.
Give me a second.
Yeah, so I like that. We'll share Krishna's review of Tohi, and perhaps that'll be useful for some people to do something with. It's always good to find new tools. Some people might find something that they find interesting and run with it. So that's always a good thing. All right, so let me share my screen. This looks like archive paper. The link is in the chat. And okay, yeah, this is a transformer network for the traveling salesman problem. So we'll just read the abstract. A traveling salesman problem, which is this problem where you have different cities on a map or you have different nodes on a network. And the idea is you want to find the most efficient path between those nodes. And so, you can think of it as like cities on a map. I need to visit these cities, but I want to do it without backtracking. And how do I do that? Because sometimes you have to, if you're going on a tour, that's where the traveling salesman part comes from. You don't want to backtrack a lot. You don't want to waste a lot of time. When you want to find the fastest route. And so it's not so bad for like 2 or 3 cities, but when you get up to like 10 or 20, then it becomes harder. And it becomes actually something you can't solve without a computer. So this is something von Neumann talked a lot about. It has driven the discovery of several optimization techniques such as cutting planes, branch and bound local search, Lagrangian relaxation, and simulated annealing. So there are a lot of approaches that have been used in the past, that very diverse approaches that are all kind of. I don't know if there's a best approach. There are a lot of other approaches as well. People have used different techniques such as swarm intelligence and other types of things, and they've had reasonable results. The last 5 years has seen the emergence of promising techniques where graph neural networks have been capable to learn new combinatorial algorithms. So these are the graph neural networks where you're building these embeddings, these graph embeddings, and then you're using those as a neural network, and you're solving problems using those. I think Krishna reviewed that in the DevaWorm group a while back. And in fact, this year's GSOC project in DevaWorm is going to be on graph neural networks. So check that out. It's forthcoming. It has, I think, it may have just been posted to INCF's site, but this is something that we're going to be talking about more in the coming months. The main question is whether deep learning can learn better heuristics from data, replacing human-engineered heuristics. I think, I don't know why there's that question mark there, but this is appealing because developing algorithms to tackle efficiently NP-hard problems. So NP-hard problems are a class of complexity. So, NP, there's NP complete, there's NP hard, there's, and this is like there are many even harder problems than that. But NP hard are generally problems where it's hard to find an exact solution. So you have to approximate solutions to the problem. Then this is often the case with the traveling salesman problem when you get to like 10 or 15 or 20 cities, especially beyond 20. And actually the problem may actually be even greater computational complexity when you get beyond 20. But there's a whole classification for this, and we won't get into that. So developing these algorithms may require years of research, and many industry problems are combinatorial by nature. In this work, we propose to adapt the recent successful transformer architecture, originally developed for natural language processing, to the combinatorial TSP. So we talked about transformer architectures last week in the DevoWorm group. The recordings are online. If you go to DevoWorm on YouTube, you'll find the recording from last week. We had a nice talk about transformer architectures. And then, kind of like we have these reviews of these techniques, so we kind of talk about it a bit. But I think there's a lot more. There's a lot of potential in each of these techniques. So, maybe if someone is interested in presenting on a specific technique, you're welcome to do that. You can present on a technique, and then we can talk about how we might use it. Because it's hard to know, the whole name of the game in a lot of like machine learning and deep learning is to take like a model and apply it to something. And so that something can be a lot of different things. Some problems are better than others, but that's why we want to talk about this. So, training is done by reinforcement learning, hence without TSP training solutions. And decoding uses beam search. So this is a typical type of search. I don't think it's a common type, but it's called beam search. And then the training is done by reinforcement learning. So they're kind of combining reinforcement learning.
Do you mind like if I give like a small overview of beam search?
Oh, you mean right now? We can do that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, like what beam search does is like, man, I mean, you can continue sharing if you want.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
we're done. Yeah.
So like basically what beam search tries to do is like let's say like you're doing like a grid search. So a grid search would be something that's exhaustive. So let's say like you have like 5 points, and then you have again 5 points which are like parallelly placed in front of each other, and then again 5 points. So like you need to traverse from, like you need to find the best possible path. Okay, for example, now like your lazy method or greedy method would be to like from that point go to all the points, and then from the other point again go to all the points, which is exhaustive. Now but this method is like NP hard. So what you do is that basically at the first when you start, you fix like a beam width. So let's say the beam width is like 3. So instead of going to all the 5 points, you'll only restrict yourself to going to like any of the 3 points. And then again, when you're going again, you'll kind of restrict yourself to like 3 points. So by that, you're not only like exploring, but you're also like limiting the search space. So it's like an efficient way of basically exploring the search space. And like this beam search, like this is mainly I think used in like speech recognition, like in your like uh, not remember, like probably like the older versions of Siri, like they used like beam search. And what they did was basically first you take the speech and then you kind of encode it, and in the decoding phase that's the main problem. Why? Because it's similar to what's happening over here. Like you have the information, but now you need to find the output, and like the outputs are like many, so your search space is big. So now the decoding part, that is the output, finding your output part, that's really big. So that's where you'll use this beam search, and this beam search will kind of find a good path, and the final path would be like your phoneme, that is the text from the speech that you're speaking. And then this again would be like propagated back in the same path, and all the errors will get updated, and this process like continues. So like this is where it's like kind of used, this beam search. Just wanted to give like an idea. And like it's mostly like used in combinations with, let's say, RNNs, or like even before RNNs were invented, this was used with your HMM models, hidden Markov
Right.
models. This is where it was kind of used, because like in HMM what happens is that like you'll have lots of paths, so you need to optimize the in the given paths which path you need to choose. So yeah, just a small thing on like beam search, what it does.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and HMM is hidden Markov model, just so we know. Okay. Yeah, thank you for attending, Krishna. Thank you for your
Bye.
presentation. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yep, bye. So there's this thing that Ankit also posted. This is the TSP transformer GitHub repo. So this is one of the authors of that preprint, Javier Brisson. So this is the TSP transformer. This is what it looks like here. This is in PyTorch, so you can use this on the traveling salesman problem. It's a nice way to like approach a classic problem. And I think we're getting to the point where we're starting to go from like these nondescript tools to things that are really kind of interesting. I like this approach because it's kind of like taking this transformer model and applying it to something that has sort of an optimization technique, but also has some it behaves in the real world. So I'm all about behavioral agents, and that's what we're doing in this group a lot of. So this is very good. I'd like to maybe follow up on this in the next meeting or something if you want. But anyways, that's what that tool is. So I wanted to go back. Oh, go ahead.
So would you want me to is there anything in like you would want me to discuss related to transformers? Like I could present anything, any idea that you have related to transformers. Maybe I could take a look into it and present.
Yeah, maybe like transformers and maybe how they could be applied to like sort of behavioral simulations. I don't know if that's a little vague, but like how would we simulate like how they're used in speech recognition, what are they doing? Or maybe if I don't think there are any. See, the problem is I don't think there are any examples of like using them with computational agents. Or for example, if you have an agent-based model, for example, and you have a bunch of agents exploring their environment, could you use transformers to? And I don't think anyone's done this. I don't know. I mean, maybe they have.
Probably, I think in reinforcement learning, yes, probably yes.
Okay, yeah, reinforcement learning would be another, like if there's a hybrid reinforcement learning transformer model.
Okay, I'll find something on next week I'll probably talk about how it's being used in speech recognition, number one. And the second thing I'll probably talk about is probably about how it's being used in your RL space. So that's something I'll definitely look at.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah. Okay. So actually, I wanted to get back to we're going to go a little bit more over the Slack, but I don't want to spend too much more time on it. Just going through a couple more of the channels. So we do have the data science ML, which is where we have, I think, Ankit posted on gradient flows. Then I saw this paper on generative adversarial exploration for reinforcement learning. And so this is something Ankit liked. Again, like we have all these different combinations of models. So this is basically like what you might consider to be a GAN and a reinforcement learning model that have been combined. I don't think it's exactly a GAN, but it's using that technique of adversarial data and a generative approach to sort of train, and then you have the reinforcement learning on top of that.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing what you were talking about, right? How you can use transformers in agents. So I think it's just about knowing how to plug these things together, and then probably it will work, depending on how we have done it.
Yeah, I think that's it. Then there, other things like these couple papers that Morgan posted. This is a policy gradient descent method. So common policy gradient descent methods rely on the maximization of a sequence of surrogate functions. And so this is a general class of surrogate function, the paper on that. And then discovering governing equations from partial measurements, which is a technique that actually has been used a lot in, I think I saw a couple of presentations on this. If we go back to the thing I showed last week about the different talks at IBM and the cognitive AI group, I think one of them they discussed this sort of technique where you can use machine learning or you can use AI to discover equations that describe physical phenomena. So basically, it's doing physics. It's discovering, say, for example, without giving the agent any information, it's able to discover, say, like an equation for gravity or an equation for momentum. And so this isn't something that is, it's just basically observing the world, coming up with a symbolic statement, and then, and then finding like something that's the algorithm will generate very complicated equations. The key is to find the most parsimonious equation. So it'll generate a bunch of equations and then sort through those equations and find the most likely candidate given its observations of the world. So I think that's a nice area to think about. This is an archive paper. If you've heard of the Eureka platform, that's a very famous version of this. There's also historically the SIC platform, the CYC platform, which is where they originally did this, where they were trying to find laws or equations from data. So it's like a knowledge discovery tool. And so those are all kind of an interesting offshoot of like artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's also Ankit posted, this is a long time ago, I don't know if we've ever looked at this, embodied intelligence via learning and evolution. So this paper is more agent-based in terms of like, I think this is one of the ones we've talked about this paper before. So, yeah. But then there's this Twitter thread that this was, I think, this past week, and this is something that ties into ethics, society, and tech, which is also another channel that we have here. And so this is, I'm going to go over this thread. I've saved it as sort of a separate thing, but this is a better way to do it maybe. So this thread is about benchmark islands. So the idea is that a lot of machine learning research has detached itself from solving real problems and created their own benchmark islands. So this has a lot of implications, not only for AI ethics, but also for just kind of thinking about what we're doing with our techniques. So this is Christoph Molnar on Twitter, and it goes through this sequence of events that typically happens in research and how we can end up on these benchmark islands. So what that means is basically that we've detached ourselves from maybe a real world problem, and we've decided that we want to make these, we want to create benchmarks as a means to an end. So, we create benchmarks often to assess the performance of an algorithm. But a lot of times what they'll do in the literature is they'll say, well, we want to perform on a benchmark. We want to perform better than maybe some other paper. And so you get into this battle where you use the same data set and you keep benchmarking on that data set. And the whole goal of the field is to improve performance on the benchmark, instead of, say, like going out and finding, different data sets and testing like you might do in science. You might have a method that you use that you test on a wide range of data. And then the idea, or questions, and the idea there is that, you're using a technique with Bayesian inference, and you use it on a bunch of different problems. And sometimes it performs well and sometimes it doesn't. But the idea is that the method is robust if it's, replicable, and that it can be applied to a wide range of problems. In this case, he's talking about cases where you have these benchmarks that people are just trying to improve performance on, but they're kind of artificial problems. So the sort of the sequence of events here is that you establish a research topic, you detect, say, COVID-19 from X-ray images with machine learning. Then the first papers on the topic appear and provide motivation for the topic to continue. Then the precedent has been established. The initial papers pave the way for further research papers on the same topic. then the original motivations and assumptions for developing these predictive models are no longer questioned. So you have these models that are kind of going, they're kind of like plug and play almost. And, to some extent, that's what you do with models. You try to put them together and see which ones work best. But there isn't a lot of research then at that point on really kind of looking at what the model is doing and the assumptions. And sometimes that happens in fields where they apply statistics to things. They'll just apply a statistical model and not say, are the data violating the statistical model? Because oftentimes, like with machine learning, models have assumptions about the input data. And, sometimes you can violate them without even knowing it. More researchers publish data in predictive models. A community forms that cites and reviews each other. Certain data sets become benchmarks, and certain predictive models become state-of-the-art. Predictive performance becomes the sole measure of progress, although improvements are becoming smaller. So, once you get like 99% efficiency on a problem, you keep optimizing on that asymptotic curve. And, it's like you're never getting, you might get to 100%, but you're optimizing for that 1%. And, that's where all the action is. And then actual progress in solving the initial research questions have become irrelevant or even discouraged. And so then that's where you just basically are working towards the benchmark. So I think this is an interesting post. And it just kind of goes through like how fields can sort of congeal around these sorts of issues like benchmarks and not necessarily break out of that and find new territory or even think about what they're doing critically. And so that is a problem. And I don't think just in machine learning. I think in other fields you see this with techniques where people just use, say, certain statistical techniques. I think hypothesis testing in some ways is like that, where you use like p-values, and people will, in psychology, for example, people will just kind of try to figure out how to optimize your p-value, optimize your sample for a p-value. And a lot of people call that p-hacking or some version of p-hacking, where you're trying to get to significance. You might have to add subjects or something in an experiment, but the experiment itself may be very contrived. And so this happens in other fields. It's not just with respect to machine learning. But this is definitely something that is something that can, sort of derail whole fields, and it can really become a bit of a problem for the advancement of different fields. I think that's actually interesting with respect to cognitive our trajectories work too, because we talk about these sorts of things a lot. So Ankit says, right, so it's just masking the original problem at hand. Well, I don't know if it's masking the problem. I think it's like if you have what you'll tend to do is you'll find a problem that's easy to solve. Like, you might have might have an image data set that's very easy to work with. And you see this in other fields. They'll use, standard data sets or standard places to go to look for subjects or standard problem domains. With model organisms in biology, it's the same way. We use model organisms because they're easy to manipulate. But that limits us in terms of what we can understand. You kind of know the system and it's easy to work with, right? And you say, we can solve the problem on this just a small area of data. Okay, so good, you can. But then if you took your model outside of that world and applied it to some other problem, then it becomes a little harder may fall apart completely. We don't know. So Ankit said, yeah, like ImageNet or MNIST and pretend wow problem is solved. Yeah, MNIST would be a good example where you have something that's relatively easy to work with, but on the other hand, it doesn't really give you the variation that you would find in the real world on different problems. And so, you don't want to have models that are too contrived, and that holds true across science. You want to have some variety in what you're studying. And so, this benchmark or the model organism or whatever become like the surrogate for a problem domain. And so that's kind of the point there.
Could you like talk in like very brief about like p hacking?
Oh yeah, so p-hacking is this thing where when people do hypothesis tests and they use t-tests or sometimes ANOVAs, which are ways to find differences, significant differences between groups. And so the idea is that if your p-value or it's basically the probability that it differs from the null hypothesis. And so you have the null hypothesis, which is that there's no effect, and there's another hypothesis, which is the effect. And there's a difference between them, and that p-value is the probability that something doesn't happen at chance, which is the null hypothesis. So, they have this threshold of 0.05. Oftentimes, in some fields, it's a little bit different. But the idea is that you have this threshold which you have to meet in your results. And so sometimes people will work to p-hack. They'll try to like modify their sample to get to that threshold. And so if you get below that threshold, you can publish the work often. If you're not below that threshold, then you have what they call a non-significant result. And so the question is do you meet that criterion or not? But that's not really the real issue you're dealing with. The real issue you're dealing with is the effect that you have from your data set. Is that effect of maybe it's like a manipulation, or maybe it's like the difference between two groups. Is that something that's robust? And when you p-hack, you tend to undermine that because you have this, you're just kind of gaming your data set, or you're gaming the real world, or you're gaming the phenomena to get a certain result. Whereas, there are other techniques that maybe are more informative of what's going on with your sample. I know that's not a very clear description of that, but it's one of these things where we often sort of work towards the metric, and we kind of say this is the metric we want to achieve to have something that's considered a successful result. So how do we get there? That's the lesson here. It isn't so much that I want to study this phenomenon and I want to understand its complexity. And maybe maybe there isn't a good method to find what I want to find, but I'm going to try to find out what the structure of this thing is, what makes, if I manipulate this variable, what happens. Science is not as clear cut as just having like certain metrics and benchmarks met. So it's that I guess is the lesson here.
Okay, I understand. Like, if I'm not not wrong, like different settings would have like different p values, right? If I'm not wrong.
Well, I don't know, but
Like you're talking about like 0.05, right? That's like the most common one. But like different settings would probably experiments would have their own p value, right?
well, typically it's like it's usually 0.05 or lower. So sometimes the threshold is a little
Yeah.
lower, but the point being is that whatever that threshold is, it's still you're working towards that metric, and you're saying we need a result that's below that, and usually it has to do with the variation in the data set. If you have a lot of variation in your data set, you're less likely to get a significance test, because it's just the variation is too great amongst your samples. Well, yeah, it's just yeah. So it's not the technique is fundamentally flawed in that way. Is that you have to assume, say for example, that your data is normally distributed, that both your null hypothesis or your control and your testing group are both normally distributed, that there isn't a lot of excess variation in the sample. And if there is excess variation, then that's a problem. And that's one thing you run into in the real world, is that a lot of phenomena in the world are not like normally distributed they don't have a lot of, they have a lot of noise. They have a lot of weird distribution. Sometimes things in the real world don't have a characteristic distribution. We have to fit the data to a distribution, which can create problems because you're assuming a certain model for something right off the bat. You're saying, I'm going to assume that there's a Gaussian kernel. I can use that to fit my data. Well, maybe you can't. Maybe it's something more complex. Maybe it's a multimodal distribution that describes it. Maybe it's some other type of distribution that describes it. So, there are all these problems with kind of like, fitting models to data that, can be quite fraught with, we think about it in terms of like assuming that will work when in fact maybe it won't. Okay, well, I think that's enough on that. Yeah, so thank you for that. Those questions. I'm going to go to the VR. I promise that we're going to review their VR stuff. So, I don't have a lot in the VR area here to review. I think that we've talked about a number of things in this area. We've talked about so in this channel, which is a lot of where our activity is, it's very eclectic. We talk about neural stimulation, for example, brain-computer interfaces. We've also talked about some of the issues in virtual reality. So there's this article, Virtual Reality is Genuine Reality, so embrace it. So this is from philosopher David Chalmers. And, this is a book, Reality Plus, where he argues that the material world may lose its allure as VR technology advances. So, that's Jesse replied to that. Tag Charlotte, who's a member of our team here. So that might be interesting from a philosophical point of view. There are also opportunities to build stimuli, build virtual objects, and we have some tools that we've sort of recommended that people use for this, ranging from 3D glasses to simple phone VR to like an Oculus type setup. And we're trying to build on that. We're trying to build some things where anyone in the world could, say, download some of our stimuli, interact with some content, but we're not even close to being there yet. So I don't want to go over that too much. But I do want to bring people's attention to this channel. And there's even stuff on education and VR. So, there are a lot of interesting areas in VR. There are some traditional areas like education and, simulation. There are also areas like entertainment where you can watch movies or things like that. And there's a lot of potential in VR, of course. So there are all sorts of new opportunities to build subfields and things. And then there's this interface with brain-computer interfaces and recording neural activity. So there's this area where, you measure someone's behavior as they're using a virtual environment, and it may or may not differ from what they're doing in the real world. So, for example, if I'm interacting with objects in the real world, that's maybe different than how I interact in the physical world, or in a virtual world. Sometimes you have limited sensory inputs. Sometimes you can simulate like haptic input with pinch gloves. Usually VR is almost always visual. You put on a headset and you're looking at some set of objects, and they're simulated objects. And so your visual sense is usually the dominant sense in VR. But sometimes people have simulated, force feedback. They've simulated haptic manipulation, which is touching things with your hands. They've, simulated different sounds and soundscapes. So there are different interfaces. There are things like head-mounted displays. There are things like caves, where you stand inside of a immersive, it's like a set of walls that surround you on three sides. And then, you might have like speakers on the floor. You might have like force feedback on the floor. And then you have images around you on three sides. And so you're immersed in this world and you can see things. And so there are a lot of different ways to execute virtual reality. There are a lot of different ways to study virtual reality. And then there's this whole metaverse thing, which is, of course, this new, it's maybe not such a new idea, but this is something Jesse posted on Building the Metaverse by John Radoff. And this is like, it kind of gives you this layered vision of this what they call the metaverse, which is basically a virtual reality world. So people can interact, they can go and do things like shopping or do social activities, as a virtual avatar. And so you have the infrastructure, which is, of course, if you're using a 5G device or Wi-Fi, high-speed Wi-Fi, you need to have a lot of data transfer for this, because you need to not only be able to generate visual things and other types of sensory input, but it also needs to be low latency, because latency kills the experience. If you have if you're watching a virtual object flicker around, it does kind of break that. It does kind of break that experience up. So then there's the human interface, which is this idea of having pinch gloves or like neural recordings or a brain-machine interface or like a head-mounted display. There's decentralization, which is decentralizing it in different computers versus just having it on your own computer. There's spatial computing. So this is 3D engines, geospatial mapping. This is mapping it to space. So, it could be personal space, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or it could be your neighborhood. Then there's the creator economy, where people are creating content and assets. There's discovery, which is like the social media aspects. So how do I know how to get into your virtual environment? And then ratings, so people know if it's good or not. And then the experience, which is where you have these different ways of experiencing virtual worlds or metaverses, which could be games or a social experience or a shopping experience. So a lot of companies are investing in at least augmented reality at this point. They have different little gimmicky apps to, get you engaged, and they'll use augmented reality to do that. And so, but then it can also be a very rich experience. Sometimes, they'll build a whole world of like a whole shopping center where, you can go and you can interact with products and things like that. So there's a lot of this is mainly potential uses at this point, but this just kind of lays out the sort of how this all works. And so I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Jesse. I know you've been kind of interested in this area. I know we don't really have a lot to talk about in terms of research right now, but
Jesse, would you like to speak something?
well, he might be just listening. He might just be in listening mode right now. So, but so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get into this set of slides that I've prepared. This is on the virtual reality in the virtual reality area, and something Jesse asked about last week. He asked about this body schema idea in VR. So I'm going to talk about this, given a caveat here, which is I'm not going to talk a lot about VR. So you're not going to see a lot about VR in this. You're not going to see any cool virtual environments. Here's some on the right here. Here are a couple of cool virtual environments, and that's about it. What I am going to talk about is one of these potential issues that comes up from using VR. So the idea here is that there's this idea called a body schema. And so the body schema is this schema that you have in your brain that is sort of a map of your body. So when you do something like walk around, or you do some sort of action in VR, it could be wearing a headset or manipulating things with controllers, you have to keep track of that. I mean, there's a tracking system in the technology, but you have to keep track of where your body is. And so this introduces a lot of interesting problems because in the normal world, you have this seamless integration between where your body parts are and your awareness of them and, where you are in space. That's all. You don't question that usually. But in VR, you can question it because in VR, you're oftentimes simulating your limbs in the environment. You have maybe an avatar that's behaving, and you have to control it, not with your body, but maybe with like a mouse or something. So it's a little bit different experience. And you also have these latency issues sometimes where you not only can have latency as a sort of a delay, but you can also introduce latencies to sort of give people this weird experience of not being like what they are in the real world. So this is something that it's based on this idea of the body schema. So let me start this presentation. This is just really a collection of things that I've thought about on this topic. So what is a body schema? So if you look in Wikipedia, there are a lot of different definitions. Some people call it the postural model of the body. So, if I'm sitting in my chair with my hands on my thighs, looking at this computer screen, I become aware of where my body is in space, my posture, and then, I'm aware of that, sort of not consciously, but subconsciously. The body schema also keeps track of limb position to control action. That's a little bit more directly related to VR because, of course, your limb position, you track that usually with your visual system. And if your visual system is misaligned, in other words, if I see a virtual arm sticking out, that's like had my hands raised, and my hand is actually not raised in real life, that can be confusing to me. That can be like a form of latency, or it can just be something that I've introduced to confuse myself. It's also defined as a collection of processes that register the posture of one's body parts in space. So this is like a registration system where I kind of always know where my limbs are. It's just a coordination thing, but it's subconscious, and it's when you don't have it, it's important. You miss it. So this is updated during body movement. So as you're walking, or as you're doing something like a sports activity or dancing, this is very important because your body parts have to be updated internally, and this is all subconscious. If you're performing martial arts, it's another important time when you need to know where your body parts are and what they're doing. And so it's a non-conscious process used for the spatial organization of action relative to the body and its segments. So again, this has to do with not only with spatial organization of where your limbs are, but that space around your body where your limbs are flailing around when you're moving. So it could be, where all the places you can reach with your arms. It could be all the places you can move with your legs. You can jump up in the air. And these are all, like, the space is important to the body schema because, again, if you have no obstacles in front of you, that's okay. But if you're trying to squeeze your way through a doorway, then it becomes more important that you kind of move your body parts together and avoid hitting the door jamb. And if you're in a virtual world and you're walking, like when you use a Oculus Quest headset, they have a caveat right at the beginning, and it says, "Do not use this when walking," because you don't know. You could hit the wall without even knowing it because you can't see the wall. You don't know that your body is that close to the wall, and if you've been in a very dark room, you know that happens where you can't see the wall. It doesn't register. It doesn't register your body's that close to an obstacle, and so you can hit the obstacle. There are a couple of good academic papers from about 20 or 30 years ago on this, where they talk about the body schema and multisensory representations. So this one is multisensory representations of peripersonal space. That peripersonal space is the space close to your body. The brain builds a multisensory representation of that space, so not just vision, but touch and auditory integration as well. Michael Graziano has done a couple of works on this, mapping space with neurons and the representation of extrapersonal space. These are two papers where he kind of argues that there's a neural substrate for this. And extrapersonal space within the sensory resolution of the body can be connected to specialized neurons. So there are specialized neurons, in this case, bimodal visual tactile neurons, that integrate a lot of this information. And the extrapersonal space is further out from peripersonal space. So this is where you're in a spatial context. I can see things in the room. I can't reach everything in the room right now, but I can move there, and my body can manipulate those things. And these types of extrapersonal space models allow me to sort of figure out where I want to go, what I want to do, really planning out my action, but also taking into account what my body's doing currently. So one of the themes in the literature on this is the idea of piloting the body to avoid or manipulate objects. And these are some animations I've made of like your reach space. So you notice that your upper body, you have two arms and a trunk and a head, and you're moving your arms, and there's a space that you can define, which is sometimes they call it a reachable envelope or something like that, or a reachable volume, and it's like anywhere you can reach around you with your arms. That's this volume. So you can actually characterize it as a mathematical model. You can characterize it as this space. Depending on your action, the space changes. And then if you're using something like a tool, like a rake, this can expand outward. So you can actually use tools that you are manipulating to extend that reach. So when you use like a rake on the ground, you're using your body, you're putting it into it, you're piloting that whole experience from touching a rake to moving it with your arms, and then accounting for where that is in space. There's this representation that's multisensory. So you have visual, somatosensory, and auditory components of this representation. This is important in things like postural balance or connecting visual stimuli with your current body position in a virtual environment. So you see things in a virtual environment and you know where your body is, but you may not have a representation of your body visible. So this is important for registering that information in your brain. So one example of this sort of reachable envelope, and something, actually, if you go outside of humans and you go to Weekly Electric Fish, this is a classic paper. Malcolm McIver and Mark Nelson and a couple other people were on this paper. This was where they took an electric fish, and electric fish are interesting because they have this electrosense, and the electrosense is generated near the head, and it's a signal that goes around the body. It kind of forms a sensory envelope. Weekly electric fish live in very dark waters, so they can't really use their vision to track prey. But what they can do is generate this electrical field around their body. Somewhere in the head area, there's this organ, this electric organ, and it emits this electric field around the body, and it's picked up back at the tail, and so it's generating this field around the body, and it's able to detect prey within this field and then move towards those prey and eat them. This is their one spatial sense that they have. They use this for navigation as well to avoid objects. So this is a nice computational model of this sensory volume. They do also move, and so there are two sensory volumes. There's the electrosense volume, and generated by this electrical field, and then there's the movement that the fish makes in a certain direction. So there's a motor volume, and then there's this electrosense volume. The electrosense volume is sort of like tells the fish what's in the environment. The motor volume then responds to that by moving in a certain direction. And you can model both of those and overlay them together. So you see something with humans similar to that. In our reach envelope, we reach for things, we sense kind of where things are in space. We know what our reach envelope looks like, we have a sense of it because we know how long our arms are. And then we see things in the environment, then we can reach for them and you manipulate them. So this is like the sensory volume enforces the motor volume, and you get the sensory motor control and learning that's indicative of this type of body schema. Another example comes from macaque monkeys, and this is a classic paper from Muravita and Ariki. This is called Tools for the Body Schema. And what they did in this paper was they took a macaque, and the macaque usually has a representation of its hand, and knows where its hand is. And so the idea, they did some electrode measurements in the brain of the macaque. So they know that there's certain neurons that are stimulated for the hand and the hand representation. What they did was they taught it to use a tool, a rake, which you can see here. They passively held the rake, which means they just had it in their hand, where they actually had them use the tool to reach for things, like food, reward. And so the rake, because it's a tool, and they are using it like they would use their hand, actually becomes now part of this representation. So the representation is expanded in space around the body. Their reach envelope is longer or more distant from the body. And this is represented in the brain in these neurons. The activity is similar to what you would see with the hand. They use this tool. And so in VR, of course, we can use tools to augment our experience. We can use touch wands or things like that, or even things like touch pinch gloves. So this is very instructive in terms of what we can incorporate into this body schema. Can we incorporate using tools? Can we change it in ways that are different from what our actual bodies are? So one of the things about representation is that it's oftentimes a map from the sensory world to something in the brain, and it kind of, it's not a even one-to-one mapping. This is an example of the homunculus. And so you find this in the sensory motor region of the cortex, and it's basically a map of our body surface. So this is what our bodies would look like if our representation were one-to-one, if our representational mapping were one-to-one. Very big hands, very large mouth and lips and tongue, because we have a lot of sensory receptors in these areas. And so we get a lot of feedback from these areas relative to the rest of the body. It's, of course, anatomically correct, but that's, but the point being is that we represent some parts of the body over others. The hands, the head, the face, mouth and tongue, those things have more sensory receptors and thus are overrepresented in this representation. But this helps us understand, maybe these areas are more important to movement or manipulation of things. And so we have a larger region devoted to that. If you were to chop off someone's hand, this representation would probably change. Much like if you had, when they study blind people and they look at the representation in the cortex, they usually don't have a visual representation. What they do have is an augmented representation for other senses. So, a lot of this body schema is about continuous tracking of body position. So this is an example of tracking limbs in humans and in insects. And so you can see that there are these different receptors that are involved in tracking the limb, whether it's an insect or a human. And you can actually look at these sensory receptors and their relationship to the peripheral nervous system. This allows any organism to track the state of that limb. So where is it moving relative to what they want to do? There's also this issue of a supramodal signal. So I talked about a multisensory signal, but there's also this supramodal signal, which is created based on this sort of integration of senses. So you start out monitoring your world and with different sensory signals, and those things are rivalrous and they come in at different rates. What your brain does is it integrates these into what they call supramodal signal, which is where everything is integrated into a single form of information. And this is the equation basically where you have the standard deviation or the variance of these different signals, and you end up adding them together, so it's an additive thing, and you end up with a single source of information here. And this is an example from, I think it's a rat that's doing a multi-sensory task where it's doing these visual and tactile, responding to the different signals, and they're able to find that there's a supramodal signal that's generated from these multi-sensory interactions. This supramodal signal is then used as a control signal. It's used in terms of postural balance, incorporation of tools, as we talked about, and even responding to multi-sensory integration. And so after the supramodal signal is created from multi-sensory integration, the information must be consistent. So it must be that when your body is, you're tracking your body, all this stuff is very consistent. It's being integrated. It has a supramodal signal. And then you get additional feedback from the environment, or it's generating some sort of output. What happens sometimes, though, is that this isn't always the case. Sometimes you can do these illusions. And this is a very classic illusion in VR called the rubber hand illusion. And so sometimes illusions like this will interfere with the supramodal signal, because the expectation is for certain features to be received in different sensory modalities at a certain rate, and it shouldn't fluctuate over time. But with the rubber hand, what you get is you get this hand that's a rubber hand that you see in the environment, and you train it so that you hide your real hand, but you see the rubber hand. And then you do something with the rubber hand, like you hit it with a hammer. And so what sometimes participants will report is that when you train someone to think of that rubber hand as their own hand, and they can't see their own hand, then when you hit it with a hammer, they'll flinch. It's this illusion where they treat that rubber hand as their actual part of their body, even though they actually won't feel any sort of sensory feedback from that hammer hit. They'll see the hammer hitting the hand, thinking that it's their hand, and they'll respond as if it's part of their body. And there are other illusions like this with respect to haptic feedback. There's the saltatory rabbit, which I think I've talked about in another talk, but basically it's this idea that you have these inputs that aren't necessarily verified by other senses, but because they're not consistent with what you normally experience, it's confusing, and so it can lead to these illusions. Finally, I'm going to talk about postural control in virtual reality. This is a very basic set of experiments that people have done, but I think they kind of communicate what is going on with this. So you usually put people on like a force platform, which measures their posture, measures how they shift their weight on their feet. So, you can measure sort of the center of mass of their body. Normally, when you're standing still, it shifts around, but you can do things in VR. You can introduce visual stimuli that will modify that postural sway, which is what you usually do to maintain upright posture. Your center of balance sways a bit from side to side. And then what you can do is you can introduce these visual cues that sort of act, in this case, it's like a collective of things that you're seeing. There's sort of collective motion, and you're kind of responding to it. You're kind of moving a little bit more, and you're swaying a little bit more. And you can actually train people to overcome postural deficits this way. You can use things like star fields, or you can use things like, objects moving around this cave environment. And you can do things like you can manipulate that. But this relies on this control system, which involves muscles and state estimation and sensory dynamics, and then maybe selective perturbations or lack of perturbations. And this all feeds back into this system of postural control. So you can actually see how this works. You have this, in this case, it's a single sense usually, which is the visual sense, but it also affects this balance or postural sense, this postural control system. And so that's something that's an interesting kind of way to measure that and to understand that. And of course, this is another example where you have different surfaces that can affect postural sway as well. So it's not just visual cues, although you can use visual cues to perturbate that control system. You can also use other types of surfaces that people are actually standing on to manipulate that as well. And so in a VR system, you might have surfaces you stand on, things you see in your environment, and you can modify those so that as to modify behavior. And there are a lot of ways to do that, and a lot of control points. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I think that's a nice introduction to that idea. I know Jesse wanted me to go over that. So that's what I have on that. Do we have any questions or comments? Because no one's done much research on this in general. Like the things that I've shown you are the areas of research that people have done on this. So it's actually quite disconnected. No one's actually done a paper where they've said we're going to look at the body schema in VR and we're going to do this set of studies. It's actually quite hard to pull off, I think. But there are a lot of things that we can learn from different areas allied to that. Okay. Okay, so that's a review of where we are with VR. We're not very far along in any one thing, but we're, I just wanted people to go over kind of what we're thinking in that area. A couple other things I want to talk about here. I'll probably do a paper and we'll probably go over the top of the hour, but we started late. So the first thing I wanted to do was get into... we do have some submission deadlines, people to be aware of. So, first of all, I'm working on the Gecko paper with Ankit, and of course, we made the abstract deadline. Now we need to make the paper deadline, which is the 3rd, which is early this week. And I think I have everything for you on that. We need to anonymize some things, but I think that's something we'll do this weekend. I'll try to get everything done on that. Otherwise, I think we're ready to submit on that. And I think, Ankit, if you want to submit on that, you can do that.
Yeah, about that, I sent you in your personal messages some things that probably my other co-author wanted to change or maybe take a look at, so you could take a look at that.
Okay, yeah.
And maybe you could just send me the preprint if I could take a look at that before submitting.
Yeah, I'll do that.
And one thing they were saying was that they wanted us to anonymize everything. So that's something I don't really understand how we could anonymize everything. Because we have included a GitHub links also. So how do you think we can anonymize that?
There's a certain way you can do that. I pulled up something yesterday on it, so I'll look at it and.
Yeah, so I think maybe you can take a look at that, how we are going to anonymize.
Yeah, I don't think it's that hard. It's just I think it's generating an alternate link or something, but I'll send it to you.
Yeah, because they were saying even in the supplementary materials that you're sending, that should also be anonymized. So I was a bit confused by that. But we can send the zip files and stuff, to be honest.
Well, I think if it refers to any any personal repository.
Yeah,
I think the place
you could
is
probably download it as a zip file and then send it probably.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll be in touch this weekend about how to do that. So I think
I think we should follow up about that because it's only 2-3 days remaining, I think.
Yeah, about 4 or 5, but yeah, it's February 3rd. It's the 29th.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we're on track with that, and then I'll get those things to you as well. Cogsci 2022. I don't think we're going to make that. That was February 1st deadline. There's a paper, but we don't have. I don't think they're going to have discussion groups this year. I know last year we did a discussion group. We did a paper that didn't get accepted. But I don't know. We'll keep tabs on it. Maybe they will open up something like that if people are interested in another discussion group. ALive 2022 is another deadline. That's March 1st. So I have an idea for a paper that I haven't gotten it to the point where I want to share it with people yet, but it'll have something to do with dual inheritance models and our agents. So that's something I'll pull up later. Jesse.
Could we? sorry to interrupt. Could we like target uh, for like the switching theory paper for like A life?
We might be able to do that. It's kind of hard to. Yeah, we might be able to do that. We'd have to kind of. It's
I
an
mean,
8-page
like,
paper, so it would take. Yeah, we'd
yeah,
have
yeah,
to.
yeah. I mean, like, instead of A life, we could target another one as well because, like, yeah, I didn't realize this. You'll have only 1 month, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think we
So,
can target like other conferences, but yeah, we would have to kind of.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I will not target A life then. It's probably a bit too close, right?
Yeah. So that's March 1st,
Yeah,
and
but you should just insert the switching theory paper so that we don't forget to write that, right?
yeah, let's put this here.
Insert just below us switching, I think. So I'll
Oh,
remember, I
well, I'll
think.
put it here. Yeah, I'll put it here for now. I might put it up there. I mean, it really depends on where we're gonna put it. All right. So that's something we want to do. We don't actually know what the venue is for that. So, and then Jesse, uh, I don't know if he's found anything out about the New York Celebration of Women in Computing abstract. That should have been something that we're, I guess, maybe they're still in the sort of planning stages for that, but that's something that we need to, when we find out about that, we can act on it. There's this We Robot conference also that Jesse was interested in, but I don't know if that's going to be a go or not. I don't know what is the deadline for that, whatever that is. Anyways, we'll put the deadline in there when we. I think it's like March 1st or something, but I can't remember. So I don't know if we decide to go for it, then you can fill in more information. If not, we can put a red mark through it and just say that we were aware of it. Then there's NetSci 2022. So this is a network science conference, and usually what they do is they solicit abstracts, and then so we need an abstract by March 11th, and then you would do a presentation. So it's not like you don't need a paper for it. I've put that in. If you're in the networks channel on Slack, you may have seen I put an announcement in. I know that we have well, Ankit put in something in there, but like I had, oh, that's not the right one. This is network science. So this is, I know that Angela and Avery have joined this channel, and so this is something that if we want to do something for network science, this conference, this would be something that we would want to target. I think it's a nice conference because it's virtual. They say it's in Shanghai, but it's actually virtual. And then, if we have something to do with networks, and it's a very diverse conference. There are signal types of networks. We can get something out. Now, if we end up not getting it into the main session, they often have satellite sessions, which is also nice because those are specialized sessions where you can also present. And sometimes they're, specialized topics. I don't know what they're going to be this year yet, but there's like last year they had one on open source communities. So, I did a presentation there. So, there's always an opportunity. So that's something we should target. And then there's this ACM AIES, and this is actually something that Ryan Callow, who I know Jesse is a fan of, is sort of on this committee for this conference. And this is sort of an AI ethics type conference. The deadline for that is February 22, and it's got to be like an 8-page paper, so I think 6 to 8 pages. So that might be a bit tight, but that's another opportunity that we have. So we have all these opportunities. Now, the next step is if someone's interested, then we need to make sure that we make the deadlines and figure out what the requirements are and so forth. So we're on track with Gecko. We have these other opportunities coming. So please, let's follow up on some of these if we're interested. Okay. So finally, what I wanted to talk about today, actually not there. I'm going to talk about this control systems for cybernetic regulation. This is kind of a hodgepodge of things that I've found on this topic. I know we've talked about this, on a regular basis, where we go through things on cybernetics, and there are all these things out there that people write that are maybe allied to it, or maybe classic papers. So this is just going to be like a hodgepodge of things. I'm going to go through these. So the first one is this paper that came out in Frontiers of Systems Neuroscience last year. It's called The Shared Origins of Embodiment and Development. So this is something that maybe, we're interested in with agents, but this is something I think more general to embodiment and development. So what does that have to do with cybernetic regulation? Well, they take this approach where, you're looking at sort of the regulation of development through embodiment. And so, they don't reference cybernetics explicitly, but they kind of develop this framework. So embodiment encompasses a diverse array of topics and questions. One useful organizing framework places embodiment as a bridge construct, connecting three standpoints on the body. The form of the body is actively engaged in and with the world, and the body is a lived experience. And so then these aren't mutually exclusive. They employ this framework to underscore the deep connections between embodiment and development. So they begin with a discussion of the origins of multicellularity, highlighting how the evolution of bodies was the evolution of development itself. So here they view development as this, at the origins of multicellularity. I would argue that if you're talking about development in an organism, it's not really the same as multicellularity emerging, but that's fine. The evolution of the metazoan or animal body is of particular interest because most animals possess complex bodies with sensory motor capacities for perceiving and acting that bring forth a particular sort of embodiment. So we talked about this in the body schema. There's this interaction between sensory motor capacity and bodies, and so these are things that are sort of have this regulation or this retrocausality that you see a lot in cybernetics. However, we also emphasize that the thread of embodiment runs through all living things, which share an organizational property of self-determination that endows them with a specific kind of autonomy. So this moves us away from our Cartesian machine metaphor and instead puts an emphasis on the lived perspective that arises from being embodied. So this is an interesting way. This is almost like very reminiscent of autopoiesis, which is where you have this circle of, causal factors and, that sort of thing. So that's this paper. Next is this paper on, and it's going to be a little bit different here. This paper called Eigenforms, Interfaces, and Holographic Encoding towards an evolutionary account of objects in space-time. This is by Chris Fields, who's a retired professor, now an independent scholar, and Donald Hoffman, who does a lot of stuff with virtual reality, and he has this hypothesis that we live in not the typical we're living in a hologram hypothesis, but that our sensory systems are illusory. In other words, our sensory systems build a representation that is far different from the world that we actually experience. It's kind of an odd, I don't know, I still don't understand fully what he's getting at, but this kind of gives you this sort of overview of this. So the context is the evolution of perceptual systems, and hence observers remain largely disconnected from the question of emergence of classical objects in space-time. This disconnection between the biosciences and physics impedes progress towards understanding the role of the observer in physical theory. So in this article, we consider the problem of how to understand objects in space-time and observer relative evolutionary terms. They build this eigenform construct. This goes back to von Forrester. They compare this to other formal representations of observer-environment interactions. This eigenforms model is shown to be encoded on observer-environment interfaces, which are basically you're the observer and you're observing an environment, and you're not like you're making a representation of that environment. So this is the interface. And to encode fitness consequences of actions. Space and time are components of observational outcomes in this framework. And it suggests that space-time constitutes an error-correcting code for fitness consequences. So in other words, you have these representations of the world, they have a fitness, and then those fitnesses are evaluated against reality. So this is basically the idea that they're working on here. So this eigenform concept of von Forester is linked to the concepts of decoherence and holographic encoding from physics and the concept of fitness from evolutionary biology. So I'm not going to do this paper justice by going over the abstract. You have to dive into it, but I think there's a lot of they bring in the Markov blanket, so that's wonderful. But these are these different agents and how they interact. So I'll leave it at that for this paper, and if you're interested, you can explore more. This is a paper on second-order cybernetics, a historical introduction. This is a paper by Bernard Scott, who I think is a historian of science, and this is also about von Forester. This is in 1974. Heinz von Forester articulated the distinction between a first and second-order cybernetics. So the cybernetics of observed systems and the cybernetics of observing systems. So the second-order cybernetics involves an observer, and it's a cybernetics that involves that observer into the system. So von Forester's distinction, together with his own work on the epistemology of the observer, has been enormously influential. And so it has provided an architecture for the discipline that provides order where there previously was variety and disorder. And so he talks about this research program and some of the ideas that were articulated, how right or wrong they were over historical time. So this is a fairly new paper, but it just kind of goes over this as a historical retrospective. And then this paper also gives an account of some of the developments that led to this distinction between first and second order cybernetics. And so this is a nice historical overview of this whole concept, and especially this distinction between the two types of cybernetics. And then there's this, this book, Mammalian Reproduction. And the reason I have this here, and I'm not really sure, I can't remember where this is, but there were some things in here that I wanted to talk about with respect to how, cybernetics is an important part of development. So I guess maybe I'll just go over some of these figures. We think about development and developmental biology in a lot of ways. Some of this is like how the brain interacts with the rest of the body through hormones and sexual differentiation. Some of it is in embryos, where you have these embryos that are forming patterns. Some of it is that you have pattern formation in different structures. And sometimes these structures are very complex and convoluted in their shapes. I talked about, in the DevoWorm meeting last week, I talked about crumpling paper as a model for some of these biological systems that are folded and, have a lot of spatial complexity to them. So, there's a lot of interesting open questions with respect to how these sorts of things form, especially tubes like this that have a lot of kinks in them and a lot of folds. Are you folding things into like a finite space, or is there some other functional distinction there? What's going on? And then all these things feed into cybernetics, because they're control mechanisms ultimately that are involved in these things. So there's exquisite timing and there's exquisite functional dependence on these things that, as they form in development and as they actually function, there's a lot of that goes on. So there's a lot of cybernetics in this as well. Okay, so that's all I have to say about that, I guess. Finally, there's this circuit regulation in the brain, quantifying control circuit regulation in the human brain. And this paper is Let me just go over the abstract. So as a field, control systems engineering has developed quantitative methods to characterize the regulation of systems or processes. So these are, any system or process like we observed in biological development in the last paper, or reproductive biology in the last book, which functioning is ubiquitous with synthetic systems. In this context, a control circuit is objectively well regulated. And this is a term that they use in the Evergood regulator theorem. It's very central to cybernetics. Well regulated meaning what? Well, it means that your system is regulated. There aren't a lot of latencies. There aren't a lot of gaps. Things work very fluidly. And so this is what they mean by objectively well regulated. So the question is can we make a computational model that fits that goal, well regulation? They've proposed some things in the original Evergood regulator theorem, but that's rather vague, and I think there's much more to be done in terms of that sort of formulation. When discrepancy between desired and achieved output trajectories is minimized, so in other words, the prediction of the model versus the actual observation is minimized, and robust to the degree that it is able to regulate well, meaning it's able to not, overcome maybe perturbations like we saw with the postural balance stuff, in response to a wide range of stimuli. Most psychiatric disorders are assumed to reflect dysregulation of brain circuits. That means that these circuits are dysregulated on purpose by the disorder. So you see this in gene expression as well sometimes with respect to disease states. You see dysregulation. You see a pattern of regulation in a normal patient, and you see dysregulation or disruption of those mechanisms in the disease state. So you see this with brain circuits as well. Usually electrical activity is dysregulated, but it has its roots in gene regulation as well. Yet probing circuit regulation requires fundamentally different analytic strategies than the correlations relied upon for analysis of connectivity and the resultant networks. So when we do brain networks, we're often looking at the correlations between different cells, their activity, and this is fundamentally different. This is something that we need to have a little bit better handle on, different variables in their relationship between one another. It's not just a matter of looking at a correlation matrix. Here we demonstrate how well-established methods for system identification and control systems engineering may be applied to functional magnetic resonance imaging data. So this is fMRI data to extract generative computational models of human brain circuits. These provide two quantitative measures of direct relevance to psychiatric disorders. Circuit sensitivity to external perturbation. In other words, if I introduce some noise or some perturbation from the outside, does the circuit collapse, or does it maintain its function, or does it get dysregulated? And its dysregulation. So, what does it take to dysregulate the circuit? Does it take like some internal mechanism, like, some biochemical signal, or is it largely an external phenomenon, like some environmental change, or a combination of the two? So this is actually predicting this stuff from fMRI data, and I think this would be of interest to Morgan, because he has a lot of interest in some of these issues having to do with psychiatry, and of course fMRI data. But I think this is a nice paper also to think about cybernetic regulation. So that's all I had for that for today on the papers. I didn't know if Jesse had anything to say about that, or Ankit had any comments or questions about that. It was a hodgepodge of papers, and I went through them rather quickly, but I can make those available on our Slack. And, we might follow up on some of this later. I'd particularly like to follow up on some of the well-regulated stuff. We've been doing this Evergood regulator theorem. I've been working with Rob Stone on this. And originally the idea we had was to redo or reevaluate the theorem. And neither of us are really like well trained to do that, well positioned to like walk through a mathematical theorem and to reinterpret it. I guess one could go through and say this is right or this is wrong, but I think he's thinking of a more formal analysis of it. What is this? Which THM? I don't know what that means. Oh, which theorem? This is the Every Good Regulator theorem. So this is something that was developed by Ross Ashby and a collaborator back in 1970. So it's a pretty old theorem. And it's basically describing what they call good regulation or well regulation, whatever that means. They walk through what it means to be well regulated or to have good regulation. And so it's just a matter, it's actually very reminiscent of information theory in terms of looking at ensembles and then looking at like how like a controlling variable controls a controlled variable. So in other words, like if I want to control a system, I have to have more states available to me to understand and control than the system I'm controlling. So it's like, if I have a system like the weather, I can't control the weather if I only have a few states that I can generate. I need to be able to generate more than the weather. So in other words, like brain states, we want to control the brain. Well, you have to have a lot of states to control the brain because the brain has a lot of potential states. A lot of like brain-machine interface. This is actually pretty practical because a lot of brain-machine interfaces, for example, they won't try to control the whole brain. In fact, that would be impossible. What they'll do is they'll pick a very specific subfunction. Like they'll pick some, like maybe like some ERP signal in motor cortex, and they'll try to predict that and then maybe put a sort of an intervention in place that allows the user to, respond to that one signal. So you have like a two-state system. Or maybe like a one-state system where you have a switch, whether that ERP is present or not, in a case where you just present a stimulus, and then you make a control decision based on that. So the idea being is that if you want to really control a system, you have to be able to have more states available that you can choose from to control than the system you're controlling. And so it makes it very hard to control, say, large, complex systems. And so they walk through the reasoning for that. And so, I think it's actually worth revisiting in terms of what we talk about when we talk about some of these issues with control, the brain, or other systems. Again, I don't have like an outline of how that would be done, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Okay, so why don't we call it a day? Thanks for attending, and if see you on Slack, and if we have any questions, we can do that. Or next week, I know maybe Ankit can present on the thing that he wanted to do. Thank you, Krishna, again.